Yo, what's up, my Patreon subscribers? In this video, I'm going to be talking to you guys about how I make dense, crunchy textures out of Foley using plugins like M Wave Shaper, which is free, and Ableton Stock Effects. And so I'll go ahead and play this section that I'm mentioning. Here's what it sounds like. So there's obviously a lot happening, and it sounds pretty complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. So the original sound was just me going outside, stepping on some leaves, you know me, and I recorded it. Here's what it sounds like, the raw audio. Pretty nice texture there, but it's not that interesting. And so my thought process behind making these kind of Foley swells was to have them swell into the clap, because without these textures, this first section sounds pretty dry. It was pretty obvious it needed some extra stuff in the background, and that's where I wanted to add these swells. And so I wanted one on every clap, and I wanted the clap to just sound like it was part of the swell, so it sounded all natural and nice and yummy. And so most of the processing that's being done on these sounds is mainly by, what is it? Let's see. Not spectral delay. I don't even know why that's on this sound, but it's mainly grain delay, phaser, flanger, frequency shifter, and M-Wave Shaper. But I'm going to go ahead and turn all the effects off and turn them all one by one, so you guys can get an idea of how this works, or how the effect processing works. And so here's what I started with, which is just this. I'll play with the clap on. Actually, I'll turn all the effects off for everything, so it sounds all dry. But here's what it sounds like with everything off. You can see that swell motion is almost there, but it's not very pronounced. And so one way I pronounced that effect was by adding some filter movement, because filter movement can always make things sound a little cooler and add more movement. But with the filter movement, it sounded like this. And already that swell is pretty much there. I could just add a saturator and kind of go on with my life and enjoy it like that, but I'm pretty extra, and I like to make this texture, these leaves, I like to make these dense, and I like to add all these new effects to make it a new kind of texture. And so I added saturator, of course, and then I added some EQ to cut the lows, and then I added this plugin called Unveil. Now, it's not a necessity. I just like to use it a lot because it's good at it's like a good reverb remover. I use it a lot for crunchy things like Foley when I'm cleaning it up, because it makes the crunch pop through without any of the background noise. And so this is with it, and this is without it. It kind of just enhances the sound and makes it a little louder and brighter, so it's pretty nice. And the last four effects are the most fun ones. First off is grain delay. With it on, it sounds like this. Sounds nice, but that swell motion is gone because of the delay and all the grains kind of spraying all over the place. And so one way I brought that swelling motion back was by adding a phaser and flanger. This is kind of a mistake, but I realized that oh, I could just use a saw down shape for an LFO, and I could turn the frequency up and down to make it kind of go like crazy and sound interesting. And this immediately changed the entire sound. Here's what it sounds like. It sounded like laser beams, kind of, with this feedback. Pretty sick, I think. And after that, I added a frequency shifter because that kind of laser sound reminded me of the sound that a frequency shifter on a low, dry, wet makes, which is that kind of phasing sound. And so this is what it sounds like now. Of course, I have this turned down quite a bit because I didn't want the phasing sound to be super prominent, just because I think it can sound a bit cheesy if it's overused, just because it's a pretty well-known effect. And then last but not least, we have M-Wave Shaper. And if you look closely, you're not going to really notice what I did here, but I have this slightly cut off right before 0. And so anything under 88.9 decibels is just cut out of the signal completely. But I don't have this mix all the way up because I didn't want the entire sound to feel super choppy and extra clean. I wanted to keep that bit of messiness to it still. And so with that all together, it sounds like this. Pretty nice. And what I did was I froze and flattened that audio and then went ahead and added some panning effects. And so I had it start all the way on the left, and right at the middle of the clap, whenever it hit, it goes to 0 in front of your ears, and it sprays back out all the way to the right, only to repeat that same process again every time. And so I like the idea of the sound panning back and forth because it gives a whole wider sense and range of like presence, and it feels a lot more massive when the sound is kind of swelling back and forth between your ears. And to add more to the texture, I added some gravel I recorded outside at the park a while ago. I made this into a loop, and it's in a sample pack right now that's not released, but I'll go ahead and send these samples on my Patreon so you guys can mess with them if you want to play with them, around with them and stuff. But here's what this loop sounds like. Pretty bland, but in context, it adds a lot to this crunchy texture. Because this crunchy gravel stuff starts to swell in before this actually gets loud again, it kind of helps carry the sound around. And I have more claps too, or more foley sounds, more leaf crunching sounds, just smaller ones between. And so this is what these sound like. And these sound extra crunchy because of the same wave shaper method I talked about previously. Without it, it sounds pretty flat, and there's not that many dynamics. But when you cut barely a little bits out of the curve right here, so anything under 100.9 decibels is cut to 0. It really makes a big difference, especially on quiet, crunchy sounds like Foley. And then I have one more sound here. Where is it? One thing I forgot to mention was the vocoder. The vocoder was a really important part of the sound, I think. Where did it go? Whatever, I'll find it later. These kind of sounds. And I forgot to mention it, but when you turn the vocoder up into modulator mode and turn the depth from 0 or 100% like to a low value, it almost kind of compresses the audio. Here's what it sounds like at 100%. It's kind of not very nice, and there's not much texture there. But for some reason, as the depth goes down, more of that original signal seems to be processed through, and it all kind of crunches down. And depending on what the range of the audio is and the format, the high end can get affected. But in general, it sounds pretty sick. I think. And so it's a nice way to add a bit. It's a nice way to make your textures sound a bit yummier, I think. It's a cool technique. And between here, I added some sound effects from a library because there's something wrong with using sound effects. I don't think that's kind of what they're intended to be used for. But here's what this sounds like. It's just a big drawbridge sound. Pretty nice. And that's literally all the textures, really. There's this one right here, but it's from one of the users in the server that sent it for me to put in the song. It sounds like this. So a big shout out for that sound because it's sick as fuck. Love that. And then last but not least, the clap. And so the clap here, I've got grain delay on. Actually, I'll talk about it the way I made it. And so first, before anything, I started with just M wave shaper on a clap. This is the clap originally. Pretty nice. I added M wave shaper and cut out actually a lot more than everything below 32, negative 32.9 or 39.2 decibels is going to get cut to 0. So that adds a lot of extra crunch, and it's not at 100%, so there's still some of that clean signal coming through. And then I compressed it because I like to compress these kind of crunchy claps, and it can sound nice, especially if you put the compressor before the M wave shaper, because the signal is going to become almost normalized depending on how much you compress it. I compressed it quite a bit because the ratio is infinity to 1, and the attack and release settings are pretty low, and so it's pretty squashed. But that kind of makes it sound nicer when it goes through the M wave shaper. Just a tiny bit. A little bit goes a long way. And then of course I added saturator afterwards and an EQ to brighten the signal up a bit. And I think, oh yeah, I put a saturator before too. Nice. And so overall the sound just is pretty squashed, pretty nice. But I had an issue because it didn't really fit. It sounded out of place with all these textures because it's just a sudden clap and there's no tail. It's just a nice click or nice quick clap. And so to fix that issue, I added grain delay before all the effects, and so that grain delay would be processed through the M wave shaper, the compressor, the saturator, and in turn it sounded like this. Nice kind of sparkly tail, which sounded great in context layered on top of the original texture. And so it just really goes to show that those small, tiny details are what make a really big difference, especially in sounds that have a lot of texture and detail in them. And so I hope that this kind of helped you understand my thought process when it comes to making these swells and textures I do. In some of my songs, I like to use a lot of foley, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, hope this video helped out. So peace.